A heavy hush settled over the early dawn arena as I stepped across the cold sand toward the spot where a faded wax tablet once declared, "The ground drank more than blood today." That line pierced the illusion of spectacle and revealed a truth shaped far below the applause. The Colosseum's tunnels remained thick with the scent of rusted iron, and the distant scrape of unseen chains echoed through the hollow spaces beneath the stage. These corridors held rites sharpened by fear, politics, and desperation, rituals concealed within the machinery that turned suffering into entertainment. Archaeological traces of votive bones found near a collapsed passageway hinted at ceremonies woven into the structure's very function, their placement deliberate rather than accidental. The weight of these discoveries revealed why this history endures, for cruelty here wore the mask of glory. Yet a sealed niche behind a narrow service stairway suggested a ritual unspoken by chroniclers. What presence demanded secrecy, even in a place defined by death? Shadows stretched along the hypogeum corridors as I descended the worn steps into the heart of the arena, where wooden platforms once rose with scripted precision, lifting men toward triumph or annihilation. The air carried the musty scent of iron cages, and the faint metallic tang lingered as though time itself had refused to move forward. Here, below the roar of the crowd, officials determined fates through a process colder than any duel. Fighters were not measured by talent alone, but by political value, potential spectacle, and the shifting needs of patrons who viewed bodies as instruments of influence. Every decision made in these cramped corridors echoed far louder than any sword drawn above. I traced my hand along a stone wall scarred by deep grooves, marks carved by restless fighters awaiting the signal that would drag them into the light. In these narrow spaces, the difference between life and death felt mechanical. A fragment from a gladiatorial contract found in Pompeii revealed clauses demanding participation in rites of renewal, a cryptic phrase that scholars continue to debate. The parchment's faded ink implied obligations that extended beyond scheduled combats, hinting that some fighters were drawn into rituals that blurred the line between performance and devotion. The language carried a weight that suggested hidden expectations, obligations intentionally obscured from public understanding. Moving deeper into the hypogeum, I passed doorways that once opened into holding pens, each marked by faint stains absorbed into the stone. The emotional truth beneath these choices pulsed through the structure itself. The men who waited here knew that their assignments were based on calculations unrelated to fairness. Some were sent upward to face animals starved for violence, while others met champions revered across the empire. A few were taken down alternate paths, toward events whispered to be darker than any recorded contest. The silence that clung to these walls felt like an old witness unwilling to speak plainly. I halted before a corridor that deviated sharply from the architectural symmetry surrounding it. While most passages followed predictable patterns designed for efficient movement, this one veered abruptly to the left before ending against a blank, unmarked wall. Archaeological maps showed no functional purpose for it. No pulleys, no lift platforms, no storage alcoves. Just emptiness. Yet the walls bore faint abrasions, as though people once brushed against them while moving in haste. The stone near the floor displayed subtle discoloration, consistent with torch residue rather than natural decay. Someone had used this passage deliberately, even if no record survived to explain why. As I stepped inside, the corridor narrowed, its ceiling lowering enough that I had to bow my head. My footsteps echoed differently here, absorbed rather than reflected, as though the space rejected sound. I imagined the men who were guided down this hallway, their thoughts sharpened by dread as they realized the path belonged to no known arena function. The end of the corridor offered nothing. No doorway, no grate, no indication of utility, just determination carved with intent. The labor invested in such a feature suggested purpose, and yet silence surrounded it like a second skin. I stood in the dead end, breathing the stale air that clung to the walls, aware that this passage held a story severed from official memory. Why construct a corridor that served no documented role? What decisions unfolded here, hidden entirely from the spectacle above? A faint beam of morning light slipped through a narrow opening in the stone ceiling as I entered the preparation chamber, the same space where gladiators once stood in rigid silence, while priests whispered final instructions that bound them to forces far greater than personal survival. The air still held the trace of incense absorbed into the walls, a lingering reminder of mornings when the scent mingled with sweat, fear, and polished metal. Contemporary mosaics attempt to portray these moments as symbolic preludes to combat, but their stylized figures conceal the severity of what truly occurred here. Scattered altars discovered near arena perimeters, bearing scorched edges and darkened stains, suggest rites far more visceral than any elegant mosaic dared to reveal. This chamber was not meant for contemplation. It was meant for transformation. I moved deeper inside, past a broken threshold where scratches on the floor formed concentric shapes difficult to decipher. Gladiators once stood encircled by sharpened blades laid like ritual markers, each edge reflecting the glow of flickering lamps. Administrators presided over these gatherings with a stern precision that blurred the boundaries between state authority and spiritual coercion. Their invocations invoked Rome's destiny, calling upon fighters to embody martial virtues even when many of them were prisoners, enslaved men, or condemned criminals. The contradiction pressed against the room like a second presence. The emotional weight of these ceremonies would have settled upon recruits with suffocating force, for they sensed that what awaited them was not merely sport, but a crossing into something that threatened to swallow their identities. A brittle parchment fragment recovered near the chamber's rear wall contained faint lettering that spoke of strength offered to the binding of fortune. Scholars debate its interpretation, yet its tone suggested obligations that extended beyond physical endurance. The rites performed here aimed to fuse a fighter's will with the expectations of elite patrons who sought symbolic control over bloodshed. In this sense, the chamber acted as both temple and prison, a site where power shaped bodies through ritual language and psychological pressure. Each whispered phrase from the priests served as a reminder that the struggle in the arena mirrored Rome's own mythic hunger for dominance. Near the center of the room, a series of shallow depressions formed a geometric pattern inconsistent with architectural function. When illuminated, the indentations revealed residues of ground herbs, mineral powders, and traces of metallic dust. These remnants implied mixtures prepared with intention, perhaps consumed or applied before combat. Their composition varied from offerings typically used in domestic rituals, suggesting that the priests here operated according to doctrines not fully aligned with formal Roman religion. The faint metallic scent rose as I brushed the floor, carrying a hint of something medicinal but unsettling, as though the mixture straddled the line between blessing and manipulation. Among the artifacts recovered from this chamber, one item offered the clearest insight into the secrecy surrounding these procedures. A bronze bowl, heavy and shallow, coated with a residue that chemists identified as a blend inconsistent with common offerings. Its surface bore micro-scratches that indicated frequent scraping, perhaps to remove hardened layers between ceremonies. The substance within appeared neither purely symbolic nor purely practical. Its muted reddish hue suggested the presence of iron-rich compounds, but its texture hinted at organic elements as well. The mixture's purpose remained uncertain, yet its repeated use implied that those who prepared it considered it essential to the ritual. I held the bowl beneath the narrow beam of light, watching the residue glimmer like dust suspended in water. The flicker suggested a material intended to be absorbed into the skin or inhaled, perhaps to dull fear or heighten resolve. If so, this ritual did not merely sanctify the fighters, it altered them. The emotional gravity of that possibility pressed heavily upon the chamber's silence. Gladiators, many of whom never consented to their fate, entered the arena under influences they barely understood. Their final steps before emerging into the roar were guided by forces hidden beneath Rome's polished public narrative. What unsettled me most was the secrecy. No surviving Roman chronicler described these mixtures or the procedures surrounding them. Not a single official handbook referenced substances applied to fighters. The silence appeared intentional, as if acknowledging these rites threatened the carefully curated illusion of honor that shrouded the games. The bronze bowl's presence, coupled with the scorched altars and cryptic inscriptions, revealed a world behind the spectacle where unseen hands shaped destinies through ritual, chemistry, and fear. As I placed the bowl back onto the stone ledge, the question lingered with a weight that refused to lift. What purpose did this mixture truly serve, and why did those who used it avoid recording its formula? A harsh shout once shattered the rhythm of staged combat and marked the instant when spectacle shifted into something far more deliberate. I stood in the shadow of a reconstructed archway, sensing how that single command transformed controlled violence into orchestrated sacrifice. Some executions carried the weight of legal judgment, but others drifted into a realm untouched by Roman statutes. These deaths appear linked to rites sustained by local cults that endured beneath the empire's official religions, thriving quietly in alley shrines, household altars, and rural temples ignored by urban elites. Their influence seeped into the arena with unsettling subtlety, shaping moments that were never meant to be preserved in public record. A fragmentary inscription discovered at a provincial amphitheater offered the clearest glimpse into this hidden world. Its surviving line referenced honoring the turning of the season with blood, a phrase out of place among standard dedicatory formulas. The chipped stone carried soot along its lower edge, suggesting that offerings once burned beneath it. When I traced its carved letters, I felt the tension between sanctioned ritual and practices the empire tried to suppress. Rome tolerated a wide spectrum of cult activity, yet anything that blurred too closely with magic or unregulated sacrifice threatened the imperial image of orderly piety. The arena, with its blend of entertainment and authority, provided a perfect veil for rites officials preferred to ignore. Spectator accounts from scattered regions describe uncanny episodes when the arena fell unnervingly silent. Instead of cheering, crowds seemed to sense a shift, as if something sacred and terrifying hovered over the sand. One writer described a quiet that tasted of iron, a phrase that suggested ritual significance rather than mere shock. These moments pushed the boundaries of public expectation, transforming the crowd from eager witnesses into uneasy participants. Their discomfort lingers in the tone of surviving descriptions, each word shaped by uncertainty about what they had observed. Excavations at Capua deepened this unease. Archaeologists uncovered a pit containing arranged remains that did not match any documented execution pattern. The bones lay positioned with geometric precision, their placement deliberate rather than chaotic. No judicial record accounted for such arrangements, and the absence of weapon marks suggested that the deaths occurred according to rules not outlined in penal codes. When I stood near the pit's reconstructed outline, I felt the gravity of decisions made in secrecy. decisions designed to blend invisibly with conventional bloodshed. Why were these sacrifices concealed beneath the veneer of entertainment? The question pressed against every artifact, every inscription, and every silence. The answer remained hidden, waiting somewhere in the darker layers beneath Rome's grandest stage. In a dim hall beneath the arena, I stepped into the space where defeated fighters were taken after matches, the air still carrying the faint bitterness of sweat absorbed into stone. Discarded equipment lay scattered across the floor in rusted heaps, and broken masks revealed how identities dissolved the moment victory slipped from their grasp. Here, triumph ended abruptly, replaced by a silence thick enough to feel against the skin. Roman jurists documented these outcomes with crisp detachment, reducing lives to brief notes on tablets. Yet unofficial writings by anonymous scribes hint that some condemned individuals were drawn into rites performed before death, rites that served political ambitions or followed mystical doctrines that the empire preferred to keep obscured. The emotional collapse of those awaiting their final summons is etched into the walls themselves. Deep scratch marks, preserved beneath centuries of dust, formed patterns shaped by panic, despair, or desperate attempts to cling to memory. As I traced the ridges with my fingertips, I sensed how each line carried the weight of a story severed before it could be told. These men were not simply casualties of sport. They were individuals whose final hours unfolded within a hidden system of influence, fear, and ritual obligation. Their suffering continued long after the crowds dispersed, concealed beneath layers of administrative indifference and ritual secrecy. Near the hall's entrance, archaeologists uncovered a textile fragment woven with thread dyed in a rare purple pigment. Its color still held a muted richness, far too luxurious for common gladiators and entirely out of place in a chamber meant for the defeated. The presence of such a fabric implied involvement from patrons whose wealth granted them the power to shape events from behind the scenes. These patrons may have orchestrated rites for political symbolism or invoked ceremonies tied to personal beliefs inherited from older traditions. Whatever the purpose, their participation demanded anonymity, for no public record acknowledged their presence here. The fragment suggested that someone of high stat moved through this space, someone who intended to leave no trace. As I stepped farther into the hall, the architecture shifted subtly, narrowing toward a doorway that led into a smaller chamber stained by an uneven darkness along its lower walls. The discoloration differed from ordinary wear, as if fluids had been absorbed repeatedly over time. No document described what occurred here, yet the room's oppressive stillness suggested that this was where condemned individuals completed their hidden role within rituals extending far beyond the arena's official narrative. The faint smell of aged resin lingered, hinting at past offerings or mixtures applied during these secret proceedings. A lone iron ring embedded in the stone floor caught the dying light from my torch. Its placement aligned with marks that radiated outward in thin arcs, patterns that did not match standard restraints used in documented executions. The design hinted at ritual positioning rather than punishment. Standing above it, I felt the magnitude of what remained unnamed in Roman sources. These victims, stripped of recognition, carried responsibilities and burdens the empire refused to acknowledge, their deaths contributing to purposes concealed from public view. The deeper I stepped into that darkened room, the stronger the question settled over the silence. What role did these forgotten victims truly play in rituals that extended far beyond the arena's public view? Under blinding noon sunlight, the arena floor stretched before me as Rome's most potent stage, a place where the ruling elite demonstrated dominance through calculated displays of triumph and death. Heat shimmered above the sand, carrying the scent of dust and iron while crowds once thundered. Political factions manipulated match outcomes to reinforce narratives of imperial stability, shaping the arena into a living argument for obedience. Inscriptions from North African amphitheaters reference ceremonial processions that blended civic duty with ritual intimidation, revealing how the state weaponized emotion to bind spectators to its vision of power. The resonance of these performances lingered long after bodies were removed, shaping public memory beyond the walls of the arena. As I walked along the perimeter, names marked the hierarchy of witnesses, reminding me that even observation was an act of politics. Senators occupied shaded positions, while common citizens sat beneath the sun, each placement reinforcing Rome's social order. The choreography of triumphs, mock battles, and executions created a narrative of invincibility, teaching crowds that the empire's reach extended from distant frontiers to the sand beneath their feet. The arena converted human suffering into a public language of authority. A damaged relief from an auxiliary arena deepened this understanding. Its surface depicted attendants carrying an object wrapped tightly in cloth toward an underground stairwell. The carving was small, yet its details were deliberate: lowered heads, hurried steps, and the curvature of the hidden item. No surviving record described such processions, and the secrecy implied by the cloth raised unsettling questions. Objects carried with that level of concealment were rarely mundane. I traced the relief's edges, noting chisel marks that suggested later attempts to obscure the scene. The stairwell it depicted matched one located beneath the eastern stands, a passage mentioned in architectural surveys. Whatever the attendants carried vanished into a space shielded from crowd and chronicler. The silence surrounding this act pressed heavily against the narrative Rome preferred to present. Why transport such an item away from public gaze and protect it from official memory? Figures cloaked in dark wool once moved through the narrow passage behind the western gate, their steps steady, purposeful, and strangely muted, as if the corridor itself acknowledged their authority. When I entered the same passage, the air felt colder, carrying a heaviness that seemed anchored to the stone. A wax tablet recovered from a nearby drainage channel referenced "those who prepare the fallen," a phrase never clarified in surviving commentary. Its wording suggested roles beyond simple cleanup, hinting at responsibilities entwined with ritual or political necessity. Along the right wall, faint soot marks formed a pattern resembling symbols used by lesser-known funerary cults, groups that blended superstition with coded messages meant for insiders alone. The markings ended abruptly near a small alcove cut with geometric precision, yet nothing remained inside. The emptiness felt intentional, as though an object once held there had been removed long before the arena fell silent. What function did that vacant recess once serve? As Rome's power fractured, I walked beneath archways cracked by centuries of erosion and felt the suffocating weight of everything done within these walls. Wind curled through the broken oak. Nings where cheering once thundered, carrying faint whispers of unresolved suffering that refused to fade. Written decrees from the late 4th century condemned earlier rites as barbaric vestiges, yet their defensive tone suggested that suppression did not fully extinguish what they sought to bury. Archaeologists excavating beneath the Colosseum uncovered reburial pits sealed with inconsistent layers of soil, revealing that some bodies were relocated long after the games ended. The hurried construction spoke of fear rather than protocol, yet one pit differed from the rest, perfectly shaped, carefully reinforced, and entirely empty. Why was a grave prepared with such intent if nothing was meant to rest inside? Beneath the arena's broad shadow, modern excavations continued to unearth contradictions between official Roman accounts and the physical evidence embedded in soil and stone. Items once catalogued as mundane took on new meaning when examined through broader ritual patterns. A scorched wooden idol recovered from a storage drain suggested clandestine practices that persisted despite imperial surveillance, its charred edges speaking to attempts at concealment rather than devotion alone. The emotional resonance of each discovery pulled the story beyond combat, revealing an underworld of rites that shaped Rome's identity while remaining carefully unspoken. Nearby, a newly revealed inscription bore a line abruptly chiseled away, the violence of its removal more revealing than any surviving text. What truth did ancient hands determine must never re-emerge?